Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Hello and welcome back to the Quiet Riot main show. Sorry that we are bringing this to you a day later than usual. It is entirely Keir Starmer's fault. I'm a very post-Labour conference version of myself, Naomi Smith.
And I'm fresh as a daisy, Alex Andreu. This is the show that co-creates our content with you, the listener. This is the last show we're putting out without your direct input, because as soon as we finished recording this, we're jumping on to our very first editorial meeting with our Ko-Fi supporters. These open meetings will be regular, so if you want to be at the next one, be sure to sign up and back us on ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod.
And I'm your producer, Kenny Campbell, and you can think of me as Quiet Riot's very own Paul Dacre, or maybe Rebecca Brooks. Actually, it's probably Tom Wamsgans. Just don't ask me to call Arizona on the 4th of November.
On this week's show, we will, of course, be discussing Labour conference in Liverpool with my perspective from the inside of the secure zone and Alex's view from afar.
Plus, I spoke to friend of the show, Arthur Snell, for his take on the escalating crisis in Lebanon, the war in Ukraine, and what's been happening at the UN General Assembly.
So, pour your poison, get comfy in your favourite chair, and we'll begin a quiet riot.
Now, you may or may not know that somewhere in between all the breathless reporting on the cost of Keir's varifocals and Victoria's sandals, the Labour Party went to Liverpool to have its first conference as a party of government in 15 years. Our own Naomi went along to look at it from the inside, while I stayed behind to look at it from a safe distance. Naomi, what was it like, and which night did you get the most wrecked?
You'd need a very, very fine breathalyzer instrument to be able to determine which of the nights was the booziest. I mean, I think the first night was pretty bad. There were so many competing drinks receptions, and you sort of try and go to as many of them as possible in the hope of catching.
Work, you have to, don't you?
Well, you do. I mean, you don't have to drink at them, but you have to go to the actual events. And the Tony Blair Institute one was at Revolution, which in itself is quite funny. But yeah, there is something quite amusing about the kind of, centre-right leaning Labour people organising an event in a bar called Revolution, but it was a free bar.
Oh,
I dread to think what the bar bill was, but that first night was pretty hairy. But that's not what people need to know. They need to know what was it like. So first of all, I cannot stress enough what an impact the weather had. Liverpool is often windy, but it's not generally wet like Manchester can be wet. This year, it was biblical levels of rain.
Seriously?
Like biblical, like the town centre flooded. Everyone was getting completely soaked. Umbrellas, useless. Your trousers would be stuck around your legs from a short walk from one part of the conference zone to the other. And that for sure impacted the mood and impacted how people were able to move about the conference. So people weren't going to things that they may otherwise have done because they were just going to be a completely drowned rat by the time they got there. So that was really quite shocking for, people that are trying to look like they're in business attire and are serious people, turning up completely soaked to everything. The second thing to add is just the sheer scale. Labour Party conference is always big, but this was next level. The number of former Tory spads who are now policy advisors and public affairs people at other, organisations now that they've lost their jobs in government was swelling the ranks enormously. The number of corporates turning up that wouldn't traditionally have done so in volume, sending double the number of staff they otherwise would. So the whole thing was massive. More exhibition stalls than I've ever seen at any conference in my life. It was like fresh as fair on steroids.
And so they've made a bit of money out of it as well.
They always do. I mean, all parties do conferences because they're a good little earner. And the ability for the left to be miserable moments after an historic victory will never, ever cease to amaze me, Alex. What did I take from the kind of corporate view from internally from Labour? Very much you get a sense that they are shell-shocked. It was an earlier than anticipated election, and I think they felt that this conference would be a rally pre-election. And you kind of got the vibe that they hadn't really had time to think about conference properly, having been thrust into an election campaign and then into government.
And not so much as an apology, let alone an acceptance from the Tories. Instead, next week, they'll gather in the wreckage of their defeat, reduced to 10-minute auditions for wannabe leaders, beating each other to different shades of blue on a show that no one's watching. Perhaps that's why Kemi launched her leadership campaign with an attack on Doctor Who. It was bad enough when they wanted to deal with Farage. Now she's doing side deals with the Daleks. But conference, at least after 3 months of shadow housing secretary, she's finally expressed concern about a tenant. It's just a pity it's David Tennant.
Professionally, for Best of Britain, this was easily the best conference we've ever been to in terms of access to the ministers we needed to speak to and other key stakeholders for us, particularly new MPs, other campaigns that are doing great work in our space, and EU representatives. The new
was there a lot of EU representation there?
Oh, Alex, I've never seen anything like it at a Labour conference. They were there en force. And that is brilliant to see because they believe that they are at an event with people they can do business with for the first time in such a long time. So whether it was member states, people over from Brussels, the EU delegation in the UK, they were everywhere. They were present. They were happy, warm, inviting, making good mood music noises. So that was brilliant to see and absolutely wonderful. At the Labour Movement for Europe fringe event, which was a reception-y kind of thing that went on for several hours, there was just speaker after speaker from both the Labour Party, from Labour parties in European countries, ambassadors, you name it. The level of excitement for what the UK and EU are going to do was palpable and brilliantly positive, and I am much more energized coming away from Liverpool than we were.
Yeah, even though he didn't mention it in his speech, which
he didn't. That was disappointing, but slightly understandable pre the summit that we now know is taking place between Starmer and von der Leyen. Remember, that only got released as news yesterday, and so wasn't really a feature of the actual conference, and they were probably trying to get that lined up before making any big intervention on it. Let me get back to the people that were perhaps less happy. If there's one thing absolutely everybody agrees on, whether they are defensive and supportive of the quote-unquote scandals that have rocked them in the press, or whether they are in agreement that Starmer has somehow lost all integrity and ethics, that the comms handling is terrible. Some of the new MPs are a bit unhappy, often for different reasons. So some of them from that strategic lack of comms perspective. I'm not being given the line and I've got to go out and defend this. And every media interview I'm doing with my local rag or local radio station or even national media that I'm being invited onto isn't there. I'm not getting the messaging support from the centre to be able to defend the position on the attacks that are incoming. And other ones are pissed off from a much more administrative, personal perspective. Some of them haven't yet met Starmer, which I think is a bit unfortunate. You've got a rose garden. You could have just been inviting swathes of them throughout the summer to come and meet the Prime Minister, have a look round number 10 and get that, congratulations, well done. What an amazing campaign you won. Thank you for working so hard in Blogshire West or wherever it was you're MP for. And I think that also was compounded by the fact that only 100 MPs got a seat in the Starmer speech in the main conference hall. So that meant lots of them were sort of stuck outside watching it on a big screen, along with, people from charities and pressure groups and whatever else. And they sort of felt a bit silly and a bit ostracized from the main show. And they were sort of saying, last year I was a target seat parliamentary candidate and I was being feted everywhere I went. The party was falling over itself to support me, help me, give me profile. And now I turn up as an actual MP and much of that has gone and they've moved on to running the country and I'm feeling a little...
Can I ask you something, Naomi, because I don't know enough of the sort of organizational blueprint. Is that a number 10 thing or is that an NEC Labour HQ thing?
Well, the not having yet met Starmer is definitely a number 10 thing. And I don't think Starmer has even yet appointed his own PPS. And I think that is part of it. I think having somebody who has been a civil servant rather than a political animal all their life as chief of staff will also add to that. A hyper-political chief of staff would say, hey, boss, you've got to meet your cohort that have come in because they're dead excited and they've worked their socks off, often, sacrificing huge amounts of family time and social capital to get elected. You've really got to, give them a warm glass of white wine and shake their hand. So I think that's definitely a number 10 thing.
That's worrying. That sounds a little bit Theresa May-ish, actually.
It hasn't gone down well, and I think he needs to get that sorted, after recess finishes and before the next one happens at the end of the year. Donors are very mixed. Some are livid that the Wahid Ali story is tarnishing them. It's now embarrassing to say that you're a Labour Party donor and everyone says, oh, why? What did you give him? Have you lent him your house or did you buy his socks? And they're all just feeling a bit embarrassed that this thing is now coming at them. Others don't give a crap. They know that it's a storm in a teacup, that no laws have been broken, that this is completely different from anything levelled at Johnson or Sunak or anything like that, and isn't sort of scandalous waste of taxpayer money, but within the rules, but maybe not declared in such a great comms way, regular donation in kind thing. So donors are definitely mixed. Steve Bray, aka Brexit shouty man who stands outside Parliament shouting about Brexit anytime MPs walk past, was at the conference outside the secure zone, but with his big speakers pumping out songs like Money, Money, Money by ABBA during Rachel Reeves' speech, anytime he saw a donor or a member of the cabinet that has taken gifts in kind, like Angela Rayner and Bridget Phillipson and Keir, much to the amusement of some and to the kind of head-hanging fury of others. So donors, I'd say, are kind of mixed on how things went. New MPs kind of mixed on how things went. But I'm going to come back to this thing that everybody agrees on, and that is there is clearly a big skills gap when it comes to the comms around government.
Mm-hmm.
And it really feels like they're owning the bad stuff and not the good. Polling by the PR agency Portland yesterday found that 30% of voters think the government is less honest than the previous government. 34% felt they were about the same, and about 24% saying they were more honest. So it has cut through, and I think the cabinet doubling down on we've done nothing wrong without the contrition was annoying a lot of people, and the kind of lack of understanding about how this has cut through.
That's not too bad, though.
It's not too bad.
If you consider that more than that voted for Conservatives and Reform.
Yes.
That is not as big a percentage as I expected.
Well, exactly. I think you make a very good point there, Alex, because a lot of people sort of going on the headlines of, oh, look how far Labour's poll ratings have dropped since the last time we did a poll. Well, not since the last time we went to the country. It's really only a couple of points lower than the 35% they achieved in vote share at the general election.
Result, yes.
Exactly. So now Starmer's ratings, on the other hand, definitely have fallen quite considerably. But why are they not really going on the good stuff? I mean, the good policy stuff that was coming out of conference. They've done a lot of good stuff, and there were a lot of good policy announcements that just weren't getting repeated ad nauseam in the way you need them to for them to land and cut through. We heard stuff about homes for heroes, veterans being given lots of support with housing so that they don't face homelessness, free breakfast clubs for all primary schools being rolled out. Rachel Reeves' speech, adamant, no return to austerity. Yvette Cooper's team talking about much more support for domestic abuse advisors. The Hillsborough Law, of course, something very, very potent in Liverpool, is going to be brought before Parliament ahead of the next anniversary.
Which, as you know, I think is a really big thing being ignored.
And Wes Streeting ended doctors' strikes on week 1. And we're now heading into the winter with the usual NHS pressures, and my God, what an amazing thing to know that we will have doctors there every single day of the week. I just sort of think that it's mad that instead of being able to major on all of that, we're just sort of concentrating on the winter fuel stuff and means testing one class of benefit and not even equalising the entitlement with working age benefit recipients was the whole message for the 2 weeks leading up to Wardrobe Gate, and then of course Wardrobe Gate dominating ever since. So it definitely feels as though some of the comms people might have been very good at advancing within the Labour Party and are not actually that good at doing government comms in general. So I'm sure that there's going to be some change in approach and potentially even personnel off the back of the conference.
Often in the world of comms issues turn out not to be a problem themselves. They're actually a symptom of something much further up in an organisation, and it comes out in the wash via the comms. Would it be fair to say that that's an accusation that could be levelled at Labour right now, that they've still not got their heads around all the things they do need to get their heads around right at the top level?
I do think there could be something in that, Kenny, and you'd know far more about that than either Alex or I, given your background in comms. What I do think is what I said at the top is that they are shell-shocked. They have had this thing come at them faster than they were expecting. They probably all thought they had another summer at home with the children and the family before being thrust into the media spotlight every single minute of every single day as the party of government. And they haven't yet calibrated to that, but they are. They are getting there. There's been huge rumours, of course, about the Sue Gray position. Will she resign? Will she be pushed? And we did see Starmer, I think, when he was in Washington, saying that he's going to come back and, read the Riot Act about all of the briefings and getting a grip on the kind of rumour mill of tension within Number 10. So you could be right. All I know is that these are people who were not quite ready for the challenge that came at them, and they're getting there with it now.
I'd be very surprised if Sue Gray went so early on. I think it would be a strategic error to give the opposition and the press that scalp so early on. I think it will mean an intensification of the attacks for the next 4.5 years. That's just my personal view. I have a theory for part of why this is happening, and I pick this up in quite a lot of stuff that he says. I'm not passing a judgment on whether this decision is a good one or a bad one, right? But I think there's been a decision made that they're not going to push hard the PR of announcements, the saying of stuff, but they will push relentlessly the having done stuff. And so I think they kind of resigned themselves to a period of taking a lot of flack, because I get the sense from him that he wants people to see the breakfast clubs. He wants people to see the economy turning around. He wants people to see less homelessness before he starts saying, look at what we've done already in our first year, let's say. And I think they've decided that they weren't going to do the thing the last few governments have done, which is announce stuff with great fanfare that then doesn't even happen.
Like the new hospitals and everything.
Because I think that really frays public trust. So I think it's a strategic choice. Like I said, I'm not passing a judgment of whether it's a good one or a bad one. My personal view is that probably there is a better balance to be struck of blowing your own horn a little bit at the time of the announcement, but then really majoring on when stuff begins to come through.
While you might be right, Alex, the consequence of that is that ministers with departments that are already cracking on and doing stuff and planning stuff, go to fringe events and talk non-stop about it. In our department, we are doing this, we have committed to that, this and the other, and they're desperate to overcome that lack of central message to try and push that. And one in particular, I would say, government department that is doing incredibly well on that front is Ed Miliband's Department for Net Zero. And I'm not sure it's a coincidence that it's because he is so experienced in government and is so on top of his brief, having held it for a very long time in shadow cabinets. That department is the one to look to for an exemplar of, here are all the commitments we're going to do, here are the hurdles we know are going to come at us because of that as we make that difficult transition to net zero, and here are all the ways we're engaging with people to try and make that as less painful as possible. So you might be right, but there are definitely tensions from some ministerial departments about that not being the right approach.
I'm sure. Riot. The other thing I would say that hasn't really been discussed or written about, which I think is quite important, is that because there's been such a succession of Conservative governments, and especially ones where the leader changes but there's not an election straight away, like, when was the last time someone came in after an actual election? I think that was 2010, right?
Yeah. As in new leader being...
A new leader that wasn't already in number 10 going to an election.
Yeah, it would have been. It would have been Cameron 2010.
Theresa May came in after the 2015 election, then called one, a year later. Then Boris Johnson came in, again didn't have an election for a few months. Then Liz Truss came in and went like a quarantine of an exotic pet. Then Rishi Sunak came in and didn't call an election. So the last time we've experienced a government winning an election and going into number 10 without any ministers already in departments, people, staff, experienced people to shuffle around, etc., was 2010. And so I think that is a factor, and I think it's a big factor. There will have been a huge amount of inexperience in trying to find their feet. But for me, what matters is whether this proves to be an administration that learns from its cock-ups. And that's not a judgment I can make now. It's a judgment I can make in 6 months' time or a year's time. But that is what scuttled Johnson, for instance. What scuttled Johnson is that he made a huge mistake with Owen Paterson and then made the same mistake over and over and over and over again. Made a huge mistake with not declaring a donation, then made the same mistake over and over and over and over again. But that is the crux, right? Will they fuck up in the same way over and over again? Or will they do it once, then learn, then have a different fuck up? That happens.
If you can turn this into a learning opportunity, fine. If not, you're in big trouble. And that actually neatly comes to another point that I kept having to make to people who were less concerned about the situation with the comms and how it was cutting through, which they kept saying, we've got 5 years to turn it around, 5 years to turn it around. You don't. Don't tell that to Anas Sarwar, who has got 500 days till Scottish elections. Don't tell it to those in the Senate. And look, those councillors up for election next May have even less time, let alone a by-election candidate coming along. And I say this with experience. When I was involved with the Liberal Democrats in coalition, you had a pattern. They enter coalition. They have a bad news story around tuition fees, backing austerity, losing the AV referendum. They have a big loss of councillors, compounding year on year on year, 2011, 2012, 2013. You get to 2014, they lose all of their MEPs bar one, and they're meant to be the pro-European party. The writing was on the wall for a Westminster wipeout at the 2015 general election. So they don't have 5 years to turn it around. They do have to do it more quickly, and there will be huge pressure within the party to do that.
How long do you think they have, though? Because it's also not instant, right? I would say they need to be showing that things are getting better, both in the country and organizationally in number 10 in 6 months' time. So I think if we get to January, February, next year and we're still getting the same kind of cock-ups, I would be very worried.
Well, Alex, that brings me to another point I was going to make. So you're sort of saying they've got to have turned it around by the start of next year, and I think that's not an unreasonable assessment. The stakeholder group I haven't yet mentioned is business and industry. And this was a conference where they almost didn't give a shit about anything that was being said at the conference, that was happening in and around it. All they wanted was intel on the budget.
Yep.
They are all pausing major investments, big sales. So you've got, property industry there in force. Anyone who might be doing a merger or disposal of a subsidiary or brand or whatever, not doing that because no one knows what the tax calculation will be for that valuation of that transaction. So there's a lot of concern about the market becoming constipated and a lack of investment and growth at the moment. In anticipation of what Rachel Reeves is going to be talking about on the 30th of October. So I think you're right. You're going to have to sort of sit out the next couple of weeks, see what's in that budget and how they handle the people that are going to be unhappy versus happy with what comes out of that. And then you're into Christmas, and let's see if they've managed to turn around the comms output by the new year.
Yeah, they better have their comms sorted out by the budget, because that could turn into a real
damn straight
problem for them.
Look, I was enmeshed in it all and busy on the ground within that secure zone of the conference. And you do look at the news and try and have a quick look at how things are landing on social media and things. What did it look like to you guys being outside looking in on it?
Interesting you asked that, because it's something I was talking about just a couple of days ago about the curse of the bubble and the fact that if you're plugged into conference, particularly this conference, it's hugely important. It's all encompassing. Outside, much less so, much less so. And I think a large part of it comes down to the inescapable fact that this government was elected without any love. And people aren't actually looking or expecting to hear good, positive things. They've banged on so relentlessly about the dark clouds that are looming that I suspect an awful lot of people have switched off completely. Not the people inside the bubble, very definitely not. And I know people who couldn't get anywhere near conference because they'd left their clearance a tiny little bit late, whatever. There's no doubt it was a hugely popular event, but within the bubble. What's your take on it, Alex?
I was impressed with some of the speeches. Starmer's speech was the best I've seen him give, actually. He's not a sort of inspirational kind of speaker, but it seemed to me the most relaxed he's been. The couple of more personal stories and jokes worked well. The vision was more peppered with optimism than we've seen, because obviously they felt they didn't have as much time as they thought they might to pivot to something a little bit more positive. They overworked the narrative that, things are going to get worse before they get better. And I think they could sense that they were losing the room. So I thought on those big set pieces, I thought they did a decent job. What's interesting is that if you look at the reception, for instance, of Starmer's speech in the left-wing press, it was a lot more mixed and lukewarm than it was in some of the right-wing press, who thought he did a really good job and he's going to be a very difficult adversary for the Conservative Party. And I find that quite interesting.
On the ground, the reception to the speech was broadly, nobody loved the first third, and people thought he got much better as it went on, and that the second 2/3 were incredibly strong. From my perspective, particularly the stuff about racism being vile, not in any way pulling punches about his views on those that rioted, I thought was excellent. And was the most passionate and sort of recognisably good political orator as you would ever guess out of somebody like Starmer, who, let's face it, as you say, is not going to go down in history as one of the great political speakers.
Whatever anyone thinks about immigration, I will never accept the argument made not just by the usual suspects, but by people who should have known better, who said that millions of people concerned about immigration are one and the same thing. as the people who smashed up businesses, who targeted mosques, attempted to burn refugees, scrawled racist graffiti over walls, Nazi salutes at the cenotaph, attacked NHS nurses, and told people with different coloured skin, people who contribute here, people who grew up here, that they should go home? No. No.
We'll see. It's early doors yet, I think. And
Indeed.
A lot will depend on, who the Conservatives select to be their leader and what sort of movement they do.
Yeah, and they select one of their leaders today, because as this show goes out, we'll imminently know who's won the Conservative Scottish leadership election results. So
yeah, that's true.
We need a call to action, Alex. If you're thinking of attending the Labour conference next year, my top tip is get your accommodation booked right now, because hotels and Airbnbs charge big premiums the longer you leave it. And the sheer volume of people that go now means the pressure on, limited number of bed spaces in the city is real. And if you're not, then I do have an action for you, but I'm going to ask Alex to do it so that it's not quite as shameless a plug.
So the action is to support Best for Britain, so they can have an even more impactful presence next year, which will be just a couple of months before the review of the Brexit deal comes up. So it really is important for them to have a big presence at that conference next year. They're very expensive. What Best for Britain is doing is it's using the proceeds more efficiently than many other groups that go. And on top of that, if you sign up as a supporter on bestforbritain.org/trees, when you donate £10 or more, Best for Britain plants a tree in your name in their pro-European forests in Devon and Dorset. And we very much hope that by the time the saplings you're planting with us have grown into forest, Britain will have returned to being an outward-looking, compassionate country that cares for the planet and all its people, and maybe even EU members once more, who knows. Naomi asked me to read an old Greek proverb in Greek, if I could. The translation is, "A society grows great when old men plant trees in whose shade they know they shall never sit." And although I endorse the sentiment entirely, it is completely made up that this is an old Greek proverb. No Greek person has ever heard of this before. It's a lovely, lovely sentiment, but I think it was made up by Ricky Gervais in his show Afterlife. Okay. A character delivers it in Afterlife as an old Greek proverb, and since then everyone has been sharing it because it is a lovely sentiment, but I had never heard of it before, and I've asked several people, including a Greek linguist, and none of them have heard of it before. So I'm afraid it's one of those Churchill said.
Please embrace the sentiment and the thought of
Absolutely.
Your donations helping to plant a tree in our Remain pro-European forest. Even if you may never live long enough to see that tree in full bloom, it will help get us to that closer relationship that we so desperately need.
I will. I have translated it in Greek, and I will give it to you.
Yay!
Μια κοινωνία μεγαλώνει όταν οι ηλικιωμένοι φυτεύουν δέντρα κάτω από τη σκιά των οποίων γνωρίζουν ότι δεν θα καθίσουν ποτέ.
And what he said was, I'm going to order a kebab for takeaway for tonight. And none of us will ever know.
Fucking racists.
While I've been immersed in Starmerology, Alex hasn't failed to keep his eyes on the real news, scouring the media for instances of snowflakery and soy boy crimes. It is, of course, time for Wokey Dokie.
Wokey Dokie.
Alex, what horrors have you unearthed for us this week?
Today's missive comes courtesy of Kim Rai, the editor of Conservative Woman, and of course, GB News contributor and member of the Free Speech Union.
Fucking hell.
So Kim appears to have found the real source of NHS waiting lists, and it is insane wokery. So let me get this right, she begins, before getting, frankly, everything wrong. The NHS is in crisis, and Labour have been blowing their own trumpet about upgrading it, no doubt with even more insane wokery.
No
The
doubt.
NHS is funded by taxpayers, she writes, and the system is creaking under the gross weight of years of far-left lunacy. Now, I know what you're thinking. There's a pretty obvious flaw with this, namely that Britain last had a far-left government. Let me check. That would be never, let alone in the last 14 years. But Kim does explain that appearances can be deceptive. She writes, these outrageous and demeaning rules originate from decades of a con-socialist alliance government.
Wait. What on earth is a con-socialist alliance?
I think it's everyone. They're all basically, the Conservatives are all socialists anyway. She continues, let's have a look at why the NHS is really in deep doo-doo, she writes. The real reason for the huge waiting list is the pushing of alphabet minority agendas while patients queue for vital surgery and form filling, no doubt slowed down by the balmy requirements of having to fill in a multitude of gender pronouns. Not to mention the events. The
What
Daily
event?
Mail apparently reports that 26,000 hours were lost to what Kim describes as a festival of woke crack pottery.
Sounds good. That's fine.
Get me tickets.
Including tea and rainbow cake picnics, gender ideology, and race sensitivity. Race is in scare quotes, by the way, as is the word agenda everywhere, I don't know why, as is minority. Diversity, equality, and inclusion is a total dead duck, she continues, considering that it is not inclusive of anybody who happens to be white and straight. And most minority group, again in scare quotes, friends I have, agree. Now, I looked those figures up. I couldn't resist it. They relate to the whole of the NHS for a period of 14 months. They're a result of a Freedom of Information Act request by the Taxpayers Alliance. I wonder how much public money and time that cost. Considering the NHS has 1.3 million full-time equivalent staff, would you like to know what those 26,000 hours equate to?
Go on then.
1.2 minutes per person per month. Just think of all the hip replacements they could do in those 72 seconds if the NHS was just a little bit more relaxed about racism. So there you go.
Well, thank you very much, Alex, and listeners. Help him out. Don't force him to have to find the latest instance of woke all on his own. Do email to quietrightpod@gmail.com when you come across the ridiculous, the hilarious, and the downright terrifying.
I now have a Google alert for the word wokery in news.
Quiet Riot.
A bit of a handbrake turn now as we turn to foreign affairs. 700 dead and more than 5,000 injured, according to Lebanon's health minister, since those pages exploded last week. An IDF chief, Herzi Halevi, now says the strikes are in preparation of a possible ground invasion after Hezbollah fired missiles at Tel Aviv for the very first time. Meanwhile, Gaza continues to be ground into dust and the civilian deaths are mounting. All this while a new wave of strikes rains on Ukraine, hitting residential blocks in Kharkiv. Zelensky pleads with the West for support, and the UN General Assembly holds one of its most fractious meetings. Two regions teetering on the edge of the abyss while diplomacy is frankly failing. I spoke to Quiet Riot regular and host of the superb Behind the Lines podcast, Arthur Snell.
Alex, hi, how are you?
Hi, thanks for coming on to chat to us. Arthur, shall we start with the situation in Lebanon? For a year now, we have laboured in our many conversations on this under the belief that neither Israel nor Iran and its proxies wanted a wide escalation of the conflict. This plainly changed for Israel at some point. When and why?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think that change might have been very recent. Obviously, I was taken by surprise, as everyone else was, by the exploding pagers and the walkie-talkies.
Yeah.
An observation widely made was that tactically this was a brilliant operation. I mean, it's very sinister and troubling in some ways, but it requires an extraordinary level of sort of technical mastery.
It was effective. It was deadly.
Yeah, and yet there seemed to be no follow-up. There seemed to be no real plan. If that had happened on the day that then Israel launched a surprise attack on Lebanon, you would say, well, this is part of a big plan. Various explanations have been advanced for this, one of them being that perhaps Israel was about to have its plot exposed somehow, and so that they were sort of forced, their hand was forced. But
yeah, I think that made sense to me, I have to say, that it was a sort of use them or lose them.
Right, and clearly if that was the case, you could imagine that they would be sort of jolted into it. But I think another possibility is that Netanyahu needs another war because he is looking at the Gaza situation, and ultimately the ceasefire and return of the hostages may be getting closer and closer, and he can't keep putting it off. He's in this very bizarre situation where obviously the Israeli public want the hostages back almost above anything else. And if a ceasefire, a deal is put together by the tireless diplomacy being carried out by the US and its Arab allies, there isn't really a reason for Israel to carry on pummeling Gaza. And therefore, Netanyahu needs another war. Why does he need a war? Because if they get back to something close to politics as normal in Israel, then attention turns to him. And that may be the end of his role as prime minister.
Is there a sort of horrible, they started, we may as well let them finish, sort of tacit acquiescence by the West?
Yeah, I think there is. And I think what's interesting about what's happening with Lebanon, and as you've mentioned, there are reports that now the Israelis may be about to start some kind of ground operation, is that the sense you have is that if they're trying to pull together at short notice the big operation against Hezbollah, well, to some extent, the point that you raised right at the beginning, the thing we've been talking about for months, that people don't want this war, still seems to be the case. So you've got the Americans are saying that Iran is not involved. Now, this is very interesting because, the Americans would never try to shade Iran's actions in a positive light. So I think we have to take that as a firm fact, basically. So the Iranians aren't getting involved, and yet Hezbollah is being pummeled. Lebanon, the dead, as you said, a lot of those will be civilians, will have nothing to do with Hezbollah. So one wonders whether there's a fracturing there of the Iran and Hezbollah relationship, which some have argued that actually, the closeness that is assumed isn't necessarily there.
That's interesting. Can the IDF, do you think, sustain a war on two fronts, possibly three, if Iran and Syria decide to get involved, even with full support by the West? Can Israel practically sustain a sort of ground operation on three fronts?
Obviously, for years, it's been said that Hezbollah are an extremely considerable adversary, and particularly a ground operation in South Lebanon would be very deadly for the IDF. And I see no reason why that would not be the case. Clearly, though, the impact on the leadership, if we assume that these pagers and walkie-talkies were mostly held by senior figures in the organization, there's never going to be a better time if you're the IDF to try this. Having said that, the other thing is it's not clear to what extent Hezbollah is using its assets. It has this huge arsenal of rockets, some of which are kind of precision weapons. And there are reports now that some of these are reaching well into Israel where they were not previously. But I don't think we're seeing a sort of full barrage that perhaps they might be capable of doing. Now, that may be because they're leaderless. The attack on the pages has kind of rendered them incapable of responding. But that won't last forever. So it seems to me that Israel would be taking a huge risk if it committed itself to this kind of full-scale invasion war of Lebanon.
Yeah. So we've talked about the possible political motivation. Is there a military motivation? As in, is there, at least on paper, some sort of military goal that might be achievable?
The Israelis will point to the fact that tens of thousands of Israeli citizens who live in the north of the country have been evacuated. And that is because of the constant rocket fire in those areas closer to the Lebanon border. And obviously, whatever one thinks of Netanyahu and what's happened in Gaza, for residents of what is commonly regarded as Israeli territory to be able to live without rockets landing on their homes is a perfectly reasonable demand. So the military objective arguably would be to make it impossible for Hezbollah to continue to do that. The difficulty, I think, is that it's not clear that the IDF can deliver on that because Hezbollah is so well embedded. And we only have to think back to 2006 when Israel did invade South Lebanon. And most analysts would say they were defeated.
It went badly.
They didn't achieve what they set out to do.
Sorry to be a complete dum-dum.
Yeah.
So is the range of the weapons that Hezbollah have such that creating a sort of zone, creating some distance would mean that an attack was not possible? Or are we talking about the IDF going into Lebanon, finding and destroying their stocks?
I think it's a bit of both. Hezbollah have huge numbers of pretty short range, fairly unguided, sort of crude ones, which they can use to basically to terrorize the population of North Israel. And then they have smaller but still significant resources of these longer range targeted missiles, which hitherto the Israeli air defenses of famous Iron Dome and so on, they have been successful at mitigating that threat. But it is argued that there are limits to Israel's ability to continue to do that.
Mm-hmm. Last question on this. Do you think there is a red line for the White House or Downing Street? Or do we have to resign to the notion that Israel is our regional ally, we're on their side, and nothing they ever do will basically make either the White House or Downing Street say, you've gone too far now?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I mean, one would have thought that the red line might be starting the war with Lebanon or with Hezbollah, whilst also prosecuting the Gaza campaign. And let's not forget that in the West Bank, Israel is escalating the pace. It's not so much a military, but it's a kind of security operation which involves destruction of huge areas of what is Palestinian territory there in the West Bank. So the red lines seem to get crossed quite easily. From what President Macron was saying at the UN, I think there's no doubt that the French red line
they've reached it.
And of course, France historically has had a slightly more critical approach. But I mean, you would never say that Macron was sort of anti-Israel.
No.
So I mean, France is clearly a strong ally of Israel, just as we are. So I wonder whether we are getting closer to that. Of course, you've got the politics of the US presidential election. Now, clearly Biden's not running, so to some extent he can afford perhaps to behave slightly differently. But I think what's interesting, one of the things that may be driving the Israelis' calculation is actually a President Kamala Harris, I think, might see a red line here. And actually, Donald Trump, he has quite a complicated relationship with Netanyahu. He might not make it that easy for them. So there may be the Israelis.
And also, he's a nut. He might wake up one morning and decide to change the policy.
Whereas perhaps the Israelis think, well, Biden, he's always basically got our backs and kind of lets us do what we want to do. So it may be that that's another factor in the calculation.
Yeah, it's interesting that everyone thinks that the possibility of the election of a Trump White House drives the timing of events to a certain extent, but actually the election of a Harris White House might be more of a pressing issue on this occasion, because with the election out of the way, a President-elect Harris could turn around the day after the election and say, our policy on Israel will be reviewed.
Yeah,
and
indeed.
That really would be a big, big problem for Netanyahu. I know it's the stuff of spy novels, but I wonder if a deal of some sort has been done that you can start a war over there, provided you do sign up to a ceasefire on Gaza.
That's not impossible, because now the Americans have said, interestingly, they've said, we're not assisting Israel at all with intelligence for its Hezbollah operation. And that's quite surprising. Hezbollah blew up the American embassy and the Marine base, admittedly, a long time ago, but America has no reason to sort of go soft on Hezbollah.
Yeah.
But it's clear that they're distancing themselves. And one wonders whether that, again, is something to do with the ongoing Gaza ceasefire negotiations and some kind of leverage that they're trying to establish.
Quiet. Riot.
Now, let me zoom you across Turkey and up into Ukraine.
Yeah.
There has been a huge intensification of action there recently.
Yeah.
There has been increasing use of glide bombs by Russians, which are very deadly, very effective, but also incredibly inaccurate.
Yeah.
And that means that there's been quite a lot of civilian deaths. We have Zelensky pleading with the UN General Assembly for not more support, I would say for firmer support, which is again a slight difference in tone, I think. Whereas we've seen in the last 2 years always appeals for better weapons or freer ways to use the weapons or bigger weapons, it felt like this time he was saying, hold your nerve more than anything. What is the situation in Ukraine at the moment?
Well, the Russian advance appears to have accelerated. So there's a town called Vuhledar, which has been contested for some months, and it looks like it's basically gone, so that the Ukrainians will have to pull out of there, and that takes the Russians even closer to some very key towns where the sort of transport infrastructure, we often hear the strategic town, but I think Russia is getting close to some strategically important towns in its advance. This is all in the Donbass area. So it's not good for Ukraine. It's not good at all. Obviously, Ukraine famously advanced into the Kursk district of Russia, to try to sort of unbalance the Russians, to have something to be able possibly to trade in some future peace negotiation, and one that they might be forced into by a Trump presidency, just for example. What that operation didn't succeed in doing is drawing a lot of Russian troops away from their advances down in Donetsk. So it's a pretty difficult situation for Ukraine. And I think, going back to the speech that you described and the messaging, I think what Zelensky is trying to do is, as best he can, and of course his options are quite limited, he's trying to sort of Trump-proof the Western support that he's getting. So he's trying to build into it certain types of guarantee and certain types of kind of long-term commitment. I think the Ukrainians must be very disappointed, because it was clear that they felt they were on the verge of getting a change of American policy on targeting
missiles into Russian territory.
Exactly, into Russian territory. Russia is constantly targeting into Ukrainian territory all the time. So there's absolutely nothing sort of imbalanced about this. And we had that trip of Keir Starmer very quick trip over to Washington, where you felt the sort of media pre-briefing suggested that they thought
it was almost there.
Yeah, it was almost there. And you have a handshake with President Biden, and then we can say it's agreed. Good news. And obviously that hasn't happened. So clearly there's huge reluctance on the side of the Americans for this to go. So I think, your characterization of Zelensky trying to get people to hold their nerve, I think it reflects perhaps that he thinks he can't push for a more ambitious level of support. He's got to try and, what's the word? He's got to bake in the support he's currently getting, and that's his immediate priority.
At the same time, I also sense a slight change of tone from certain key figures that may have been going a little bit wobbly on Ukraine, especially in the Republican Party, because Russia is now striking such obvious partnerships with Iran and North Korea, that it has shifted Italy much more into the absolute foe column for a few people. So will that turn out to be a bit of a misstep by Putin?
It's a very interesting question because obviously what he's getting is he's getting supplies. And just as Ukraine, is dependent on Western support, Russia is increasingly dependent on outside support. You rightly drew attention to Iran and North Korea, but the other one now that's becoming more and more important is China. Now, China has tried to sort of walk the line of not actually giving the Russians full weapons. But to be honest, the components that are in Russian weapons are almost all coming from China now. And so the fig leaf is not really covering anything anymore.
Yeah, we just gave them a DIY kit.
Yeah, basically, with nice instructions written out in Russian so that they can sort of, like an IKEA thing with the...
If they're anything like the translations I see of Chinese instructions.
They're completely incomprehensible.
It's going to be a massive problem.
Yeah. But yeah, so I think in some sense it sort of globalizes the issue. And I think it's obviously very easy for America to push very firmly on the Iranian and North Korean elements of this because, they are completely opposed.
Yeah.
Obviously, America's relationship with China is much more complicated. There are many more contingencies and factors that they have to weigh up. And I think all that feeds back into the immense caution that we've seen all the way through and in the Biden White House and Biden's national security advisor, particularly, just a real reluctance to let things escalate. Whereas, interestingly, European countries, of course, we're closer to what's happening physically. We are arguably being more sort of forward-leaning.
And I wonder if the proximity of the election makes it imperative not to make a mistake.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you're right.
And in some ways, the easiest way to not make a mistake is to kick decisions past November.
If you had some incredible escalation of tensions, a sort of Cuban Missile Crisis style situation in the run-up to an election, I think, Trump would get a boost and it would be the October surprise that he was looking for.
Yeah. Okay, final question. We've also seen David Lammy and Keir Starmer make their first speeches at the UN General Assembly, respectively, as Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me that the language was more direct than we have seen in a very, very long time. What do you think?
I think that's right. And I think there's a sense the backdrop to the General Assembly this year is just terribly grim. We've talked about Ukraine. We've talked about situation in the Middle East. We haven't talked about Sudan. And that's a war that has killed hundreds of thousands, displaced tens of millions.
Yeah.
Has created a famine that will kill several million this year and next. The UN is there to stop these things from happening, and the UN isn't succeeding. And if listeners are interested, they can go to my podcast where I discuss this with a UN expert. There's a problem. What is the UN for? So I think that there's this sense of frustration, and I think in particular this sense that Britain, we have kind of been all in with Ukraine, possibly because we're reacting against a sort of sense of collective guilt of having made London such an easy place for Russian dirty money over the preceding years. I don't, that's one version of why this might be happening. But I think Britain is looking at a situation where our commitment to Ukraine is one that we're going to struggle to sustain, that the Americans may not be very interested in actually joining with us. And actually, Europe doesn't have the manufacturing capacity. We don't have the industrial base to do what we seem to think we ought to do to secure Europe's borders.
How do you think their speeches will have gone down with the wider international political community? Will they have seen them as players taking their rightful place, or will they have been slightly vexed by the new kids on the block coming in and behaving a little bit like Johnny Big Balls?
I think that's always a risk with British diplomacy in our current sort of cycle of our long history. We do sort of expect everyone to take us immensely seriously. I think, given particularly Starmer's background in law, the UN is quite a sort of legalistic environment. Yeah. I think a lot of people will respect that and see that he's a sort of serious person and clearly, night and day compared to recent prime ministers. But I think there is this slight tendency for Britain to stand up and address the world as if it were not an imperial power, because we're not telling people what to do. We're sort of saying that, great nations need to work together to solve the world's problems. And then the question will be, but what exactly is it that you're offering? Not long ago, what we could offer was that we had a huge development budget. We were genuinely significant players. And what we've done there is we've done two things. We've cut the budget. We've also used the budget
redirected it to domestic stuff, basically.
Domestic stuff like hotels where we house in very unpleasant conditions migrants. And so we've forfeited a lot of our sort of seriousness with which we would be considered. The other thing worth considering is that one of the things that makes the UN General Assembly important is that it's all the stuff that is in the margin, those sorts of interactions. And again, I think Starmer in those contexts will come across as serious and someone to interact with in a productive way, and not someone who's just there to sort of tell a few funny anecdotes. And Lammy, again, Lammy's own story, both his family history, but also his time spent in America. I think he's a good foreign secretary, and I think he can make a lot from those kinds of meetings that he'll be holding this week.
Thank you, Arthur. Illuminating as ever. We will drop a link to your podcast in the show notes. And I hope to chat to you soon more fully about domestic politics and under happier circumstances, maybe.
Always love to do that.
Now, in terms of call to action, just remember that the vast majority of those who suffer in all those conflicts are civilians. So we will drop links in the notes to Arthur's preferred Ukraine charity and to the urgent UNICEF appeal for Lebanon.
Quiet, Riot.
Now, given the relentlessly gloomy grind of headlines about war, economic misery and populist rhetoric, more than one of our browbeaten listeners has written in to recommend we add a new regular segment highlighting a good news story to cheer us all up. So, I'm delighted to introduce Grin and Share It, where one of us finds a happy story for your delectation. And when we say happy, we don't necessarily mean stories about rescued kittens. For example, this week, there's a touch of technology about the feature. Naomi, what have you found for us?
The inspiration for this inaugural Grin and Share It, and you do have to share it, is courtesy of Barcelona, where the city have successfully turned the subway system into a powerhouse for electric vehicles. They've captured the braking power of energy from trains around the network to reduce emissions and power electric vehicles. And they think this is going to save 3.9 metric tons of CO2 every year. So to kind of talk you through the what, every time you have a train rumbling into a stop at a station, the energy generated by all the friction is being converted into electricity. That then gets fed through inverters and distributed across the metro system. So 1/3 of that is powering the trains. The rest of it is juice for things like the lights, the escalators, and a growing network of EV charging points. Lots of cities like Vienna, Philadelphia, Sao Paulo use this kind of regenerative braking to some degree. And Barcelona is among the few to use it this extensively and very much the first to tap into it for electrical vehicle charging. And when I was at the Labour Party conference this week, one of the very, very good Best for Britain roundtables that we held with business and industry and ministers came up with similar policy initiatives. There was one being mooted around using the network rail grid to expand the capacity of the national grid. There were ideas around having electric vehicle charging points that can feed excess power back into the grid rather than just having a one-way drain out of the system and into the car battery.
Oh, wow.
So if you plug your car in overnight to charge it, and during the night your battery is fine, it's fully charged, doesn't need any more, suddenly we have a surge requirement because of something happening elsewhere, it can actually take it back out, feed it into that, and then top you up again before morning, so when you come to unplug your car, it is fully charged. So really smart use of technology coming to the rescue in policy ideas. There's something I think we can all agree is a good news story, and we should all grin and share it. So we'll pop a link in the show notes for you, so that you can read all about it. Alex, have you found something too?
So I think I slightly misunderstood the brief. I didn't realise we were meant to find stories that made us smile with humanity and togetherness. I thought we were also looking for stories that perhaps made us cackle with vicious schadenfreude.
Oh God, what have we got?
On which, this is the sound of Alex Jones having all his assets, including his InfoWars channel, liquidated, auctioned off bit by bit this week in order to cover some of the $1 billion worth of damages he has been ordered to pay to the families of the Sandy Hook shooting victims after defaming them by insisting they were actors who had not lost a child.
We're going to beat these people. I'm not trying to be dramatic here, but it's been a hard fight. These people hate our children.
Want to hear it again?
Yeah.
We're going to beat these people. I'm not trying to be dramatic here, but it's been a hard fight. These people hate our children.
One last time?
Oh, yes.
We're going to beat these people. I'm not trying to be dramatic here, but it's been a hard fight. These people hate our children.
So there you go. Go fash, lose cash. And that's it. Thank you so much to our guest Arthur, and well done, Naomi, for making it through the show on approximately 4 hours sleep this week.
And as ever, our heartfelt thanks to all of you for tuning in. Again, we'll be back with a Sunday school edition over the weekend.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to us, leave us a review, support us on Ko-Fi, ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod, to be included in the next editorial meeting.
Bye for now, and we'll see you again very soon.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreo and me, Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sanguita, artwork by Simona Cadalou. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sandstone Global. See ya!
I'm making an effort to stop vaping while we're recording stuff, because there's been a couple of occasions recently where you can basically hear where the other person is talking. You can hear a sort of